Thanks very much, Coral. A very welcome call to arms for all of us. Our last speaker is a doctor, but he's not a medical doctor. Quaint university tradition calls him a doctor of philosophy. He's not really a philosopher, though he probably is. He's trained in English. This is Neil James. He's the executive director of the Plain English Foundation, which combines plain English training and editing with a campaign for more ethical public English. He's worked in government and the media. He's published 3 books, including one on the rhetoric of the professions. I must read that now. He's a regular speaker on the use of language in the media, and I've asked him to talk about the emotive power of the language used on both sides of the debate. Dr. Neil James.
I'm going to talk to you about words. And I must acknowledge at the start that I'm not an expert in assisted death or voluntary euthanasia. I'm a grammar nerd. Some of us have to be. I'm interested in language, and particularly the ethical use of language. The organisation I work for, the Plain English Foundation, is actively seeking to promote a more ethical language of public exchange, right across so many contexts. That includes being able to understand a document you might receive from an insurance company or a bank. It includes a much clearer and more transparent language being used in our political discourse. All of which goes up to the very important participation that we have in our society. And I'm going to talk to you about what I'm calling the ethics of contested terms, the language that tends to follow when we are dealing with issues of social and political difficulty. But I'm going to start with a birthday, because, I don't know about you, but it's been a while since I got terribly excited about a birthday myself. In fact, I try and forget them, but I tend to try and concentrate on birthdays of other things. And this year was the birthday of a particularly important speech you may have encountered recently. 50 years since Martin Luther King's I Had a Dream speech. Caused me to revisit it. I've talked about it in the media recently. And it was great going back to that speech, one of the greatest texts of the previous century, and being reminded of its great power, which still electrifies even today. However, there was one thing that struck me when I went back to the speech recently to comment on it, and that was a particular word. That was the word Negro. And it struck me because, of course, it's not a word that we would tend to use today. And it was a reminder that the area of race relations, particularly in the United States, the language related to that has been on something of a journey. Once upon a time, and not that long ago, the Association for the Advancement of Coloured People was one of the principal advocate organisations for what today we would call African Americans. Martin Luther King tended to use the word coloured person and tended to use the word Negro. Of course, as that moved through the 1970s into the 80s, that term tended to be then substituted for words like black, words like Afro-American, which I find hard to read without thinking of a haircut myself, and now much more typically African-American. Because what we're dealing with here, and I want to take a slightly broader context for the discussion of the language of assisted dying and voluntary euthanasia, is what a philosopher and ethicist might call, if we were to pick up the language of W.B. Galley, an essentially contested concept. In other words, an idea that in the social and political discourse of its era is difficult to resolve, that continues to be in dispute, and that cannot be settled by appeal alone to empirical evidence, linguistic usage, or the canons of logic. Doesn't mean those things aren't in play, but the contested concept can't be resolved with those things alone. And if there's anything that I've learned, because I'm often asked to speak about language and speak about the usage of language in the media, and if there's anything that I've learned from doing that in recent years, is that when you have, as Gally would have termed it, an essentially contested concept, it is always going to be contested in part through the language. And two further observations. Every generation thinks that it's nailed it. Every generation thinks that, okay, those guys, 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, they really didn't have it right, but we've got it right now. And the conclusion that I've reached in looking at these issues over a number of years is that every generation is generally wrong. One of the things that is part of the nature of a essentially contested concept is that the language continues to change. So I want to look at the language of assisted dying, or voluntary euthanasia, with some of those broader histories in mind, and refer briefly to other areas, other contested concepts to do with warfare, race, disability, and body size, and to start to think about how does the language in those contexts tend to change? Are there patterns? Can we learn from some of what happens in those areas and apply that to thinking about, in particular, what might be an ethical framework for the language of assisted dying? And I found that there are, broadly speaking, 4 pathways that the language can travel when it comes to dealing with contested concepts. What I call the medical, the sociological, the people first pathway, and the advocacy pathway. And you may want to guess which particular pathway the language of assisted dying tends to fall into. I want to talk about these briefly, and then move beyond that to look at where we're at the moment with the language of voluntary euthanasia, and what principles might we want to apply in thinking about the language that we use, understanding that when you're dealing with a contested concept, that the language is going to be a very changeable thing. I'm sure when Martin Luther King gave that speech and used the word Negro, he wasn't thinking that 50 years later that would have a completely different impact to an audience hearing that word as it would today. The medical pathway is probably the easiest in many respects. And it's a way of trying to bring some objectivity, I guess, to a contested concept by drawing on the authority, the neutrality of medicine. And a good example of that is the way the language to do with battle trauma has changed. A couple of centuries ago, there were terms such as soldier's heart or effort syndrome, terms that would not be familiar to many of us today. We were more familiar with the term shell shock. And then, of course, into the Second World War combat fatigue. And now today, we tend to hear the term post-traumatic stress disorder, or that initialism, PTSD. Similarly, body size, dealing with the issue of people who are of a size larger than what is considered the norm in various contexts. Fat would be one word for it. Of course, that has all sorts of negative connotations. The medical pathway, where terms can be defined in a medical way, morbidly obese, overweight, and defined in an empirical way, is one pathway for resolving, or at least attempting to resolve, the conversation around difficult concepts. There's the sociological pathway. This is a more descriptive approach, which attempts, just as the journey of race relations in America has gone, to use a more sociological, generic descriptive term. You see the same thing in descriptions of language difference. People who speak English as a second language more recently have become colds, or people of culturally and linguistically diverse communities, for example. It's an attempt to try and bring a bit more neutrality and objectivity around issues that can be difficult to talk about. More recently, there is been a movement called the People First movement, which basically looks to frame the discussion around contested concepts through literally using the word person or people. So many of you may be aware of this shift that has happened in our in our recent history to move away from using terms like disabled person in a way that it tends to describe or define a person to a person with a disability. Less familiar in Australia, but certainly more familiar in the United States, is the person of size as a term being used, building on this person or people first sort of pathway as an alternative to that sort of medical pathway for resolving what is a contested term. But then we have what I call the advocacy pathway, and this is where assisted death, voluntary euthanasia tends to fall. And it's where a contested concept basically divides into two paths. And those two paths, and the other classic example of this, of course, is the discussion and the language that surrounds abortion or termination, where the two positions become polarised, and those positions end up being reflected very heavily in the language. Depending on whether you're pro, you're more likely to use one set of words, or whether you're anti, you're more likely to use another set of words, and I'm sure everyone in the room is familiar with both of those sets of words. And it's understandable because we know that language changes perception. We know that the words we use will influence how people respond to essentially contested concepts. May Gallup poll from this year, for example, found, this is in the United States, that 70% of the public will support voluntary euthanasia if it's described as, do you support ending a patient's life by some painless means? But that support drops to 51% if it's described as assist a patient to commit suicide. And that word suicide is of course, I was about to say a killer, and the pattern is fairly consistent. If you look at the Gallup poll, they've been taking certainly the question with the word suicide in it over the last 15 years, and you can see that it's a reasonably consistent trend over that time. They've been asking the question to do with painless means for a little bit longer, although there were large gaps between when they did take that poll. I'm not sure how valid some of those lines would be before about 92. But you can see there is a much different gap, depending on the language that we use. And this is why we have the advocacy pathway in dealing with voluntary euthanasia. I had a look at about, in preparing for today, 40 to 50 different references, and looked at mapping out what were the words that were being used in different contexts. And the first thing that struck me was just how polarised it was. Depending on the position that the author was taking of a particular paper, if they were opposed, these were the kinds of words that you would be seeing. You were more likely to see the word euthanasia without the word voluntary. Was a very common thing. The word suicide seems to have become a bit of a touchstone in more recent times. There were some stronger words that didn't occur in all of the references that took the opposed position, but you did tend to see very commonly right to life sort of language being used, and at times words like mercy killing, and with some of the more extreme examples, using words like poison instead of medication, and so on, and words like homicide or legalised homicide. I'm sure you've all encountered those. On the other hand, you have a completely different set of words, a completely different cluster of meaning, where the reference is largely an advocate or even more neutral towards the concept of voluntary euthanasia. Where euthanasia was used, it tended to be accompanied with the word voluntary. Dying with dignity, of course, end-of-life choices, compassionate choices, words that we've been hearing this afternoon. If we took a transcript, sorry, I'm a grammar nerd, I can't help but to do this, to start to notice, to start to map. I always look for a good corpus. As a linguist, that just means a body of words, and then to analyse the body of words, we would find out of today's gathering that these are the words that would be more likely to have turned up this afternoon. You can also see, and the second thing that struck me looking at the literature, looking at the language, was just how changeable and unstable it has been in recent times. And you can get a measure of that by looking at the names of advocacy organisations that are pro-voluntary euthanasia. And in particular, in the last 20 to 30 years, there have been quite a lot of name changes, as I'm sure you are aware. And that also, to me, is an indication that this contest of the concept of voluntary euthanasia is hotting up. That there seems to be a lot more going on with the language and change in the language as part of that. Now I'm interested then in looking at okay, we're in this situation with the language of assisted dying where we have really polar positions. We have completely different, when you look at references, it's almost as if you could be reading about different concepts. The language is so sharply divided. What principles might we apply as a linguist, as somebody whose ethical interest is about language? Are there some ethical principles we might apply? And I stress principles that we might apply that are separate to the ethics of the concept itself. In other words, there is an ethics before and against the concept of voluntary euthanasia or assisted death, which is one thing. Are there some ethical principles we might be able to apply just thinking about the language that we might choose, regardless of which side of the concept that you might support? And these are the five that I sort of have distilled in recent years, and the things I consider whenever I'm asked for an opinion on a particular concept. The first one is keep it concrete and keep it real. This is where we can often verge into the realm of doublespeak. We hear this a lot in the military, for example, with a term like collateral damage or deconflicting. These are euphemisms that are deliberately designed to paper over the unpleasant. Somebody doesn't lose their job anymore, they have a career transition program. Even in the medical sphere, a term such as a negative patient care outcome, which means a death. Or as one airline did not so long ago, no, it wasn't an emergency crash landing, it was an unauthorised descent to an altitude below that of the runway. The thing about my job is I never have to make these things up. But on the other side, apart from avoiding euphemism, I would argue avoiding strongly emotive terms, to try and keep, now I'm not naive enough to suggest that that we can be entirely objective about essentially contested terms, but to try and minimise the amount of emotion. And that's where terms like mercy killing, in the context of assisted death, and certainly the term suicide, would start to run counters to that first ethical principle. But beware the definitional fallacy. Beware of making your case by describing or defining what you want in a term that presupposes the position that you're making. And the classic example of the definitional fallacy I like to cite is the term economic rationalism. By choosing a word like rationalism, but of course economic rationalism is just advancing a particular policy position, but by choosing a word like rationalism, it is deliberately choosing a word that has positive associations to reinforce, argue through definition, argue through the wording, and it's a form of argument that I suggest we do at our peril. We're much better to try and keep our terms as neutral as we can, regardless of what position that you take, and than to try and assert what we're arguing for. The third principle is one that I find at times runs counter to the first two, and that is, if in doubt, privilege those who are the least powerful. Think about those in a particular situation and ask yourself, what is the language that those who are the least empowered would prefer to use? And let me give you a couple of examples. Now, from a plain English point of view, I'm not a fan of acronyms and initialisms. And a term such as post-traumatic stress disorder, at first glance, causes me some concern. Because it does leach the life out of a very real and very difficult phenomenon. I like terms like shell shock or combat fatigue because they are very real, thinking about principle number one. However, I had a bit of a change of heart when I came to the realisation that many veterans actually prefer this term. Why? Because it gives recognition to a condition that for many, many decades was denied. And that is something that is sufficient to help sway me in considering, even though that might go contrary to some of my other principles. So always do consider who is in a situation where we're dealing with a contested concept that is least empowered. What is the language that they would prefer? And that for me is a very important consideration, even if other principles might take you another way. Avoid absolutes. It sounds common sense to say to avoid the extremes, but it's something, and the whole way that and certainly in my adult life, the term political correctness has turned from a slightly left-wing joke into a term of derision, really has come from cases where we took things to extreme. A classic case from my point of view is, and this is again a real example of where a chain of nursery schools in the United Kingdom changed the words to bar bar black sheep to bar bar rainbow sheep. As well as, apart from being a crime against poetry, it completely misses the point that in fact the original nursery rhyme was in fact an allegory about taxation. Consider the context. Consider the context. And I do find that there is a tendency among some people to enter into what I call the gotcha dynamic. I remember being at a meeting not that long ago when we were talking about people of a second language background, and somebody piped up and said, well, you do realise that the correct term that you must be using now is people of culturally and linguistically diverse backgrounds. And I felt like saying, look, fair enough, and I completely agree with you, except for the sort of tone of almost glee with which you announced that. And there is that we should not deny, that sort of gotcha element. And you know, sometimes the media enshrines this a lot with our politicians as well. Avoid those kinds of gotcha temptations. And strive for, as much as you can, a common language. And I use that verb deliberately, strive for it. I know it's not going to be the easiest thing to do, to strive for a common language with somebody who has an opposing point of view. But we're more likely to progress, to resolve essentially contested concepts if we have a common language to be working with. Now, if we put those things together, I find it a reliable basis to think my way through whenever I'm asked a particular question about terminology. Recently, for example, a question came up about a health department was banning the use of the word mate in sort of doctor or health professional and patient relationships. One government organisation suggested that people stop referring to the drought when we were in the middle of the drought a few years ago and start referring to the big dry, because that somehow would have less psychological impact on the farmers involved. So these questions do come up in the day-to-day. If we were to apply these principles to the current language and this divided language that we find ourselves with, there are some terms that do come out as being more problematic than others. And there are terms on both sides, although I have to say, to be honest, I have more problems with the terms on the anti-side. Terms like murder, killing, suicide, I don't think help us. But I also think we ought to be careful with using terms like dignity, compassion and choices. No matter how the position we advocate or heartfelt we are about the position we advocate, assisted dying is not the only way that one can die with dignity. We need to be careful about this language because it also has the potential to further polarise. What might the common or the middle ground be? Well, I have to say I was a tad nervous coming along today, and I was with a forum, obviously, where we have advocates for a particular position, and to talk about, well, let's face it, I put the word dignity on my list of problematic terms, and we're at the Dying with Dignity forum. But I was reassured that even in Richard's opening remarks, the two terms that he used were assisted death and voluntary euthanasia. They, I think, looking at the literature, looking at the reference points, seem to be a good middle ground to be using. It doesn't mean we mightn't use some of those other terms in other contexts, but do consider the impact and the ethics of using some of those. These two terms seem to me to be a reasonable middle ground from an ethical viewpoint, to do with the language separately to do with the ethics of the concept itself. But remember that we are dealing with an essentially contested term. It's going to be something that is fluid. Each generation is going to continue to wrestle with this. It's not something that we're going to resolve in our lifetime. All I would suggest is that we attempt to do so with an ethical framework in addition to the ethical framework related to the concept itself. And I just wanted today to share what I find useful as some principles in dealing with the language of such concepts. Thank you very much for your attention.